Hello, welcome to the webinar, Safe Transport of Children Who Use Wheelchairs, an Update and Case Studies. This is sponsored by the Maryland Institute for Emergency Medical Services Systems and brought to you through funding by the Maryland Highway Safety Office. I am Suzanne Ogaitis-Jones, your moderator, and I coordinate the Child Passenger Safety and Occupant Protection Healthcare Program here at MIMS. So our presenters today are our main speaker is Therese Pellicano. She's a recently retired transportation manager for the Frederick County Public School System, where she was there for 15 years. Prior to working in Frederick County, she worked for Montgomery County Fire and Rescue on their child passenger safety program. She is a CPST. Our other speaker is Elizabeth Farrell. She is a physical therapist at Kennedy Krieger Institute in Baltimore, where she has been for a number of years. She's also a child passenger safety technician, and for the past couple of years has been one of Maryland's 2 special needs CPS instructors. And I very briefly want to mention that I'm going to recommend that you also hear a video that we recorded a couple years ago from Carolyn Derriman, but that would be a really good companion piece to this, and I'll cover that again at the end. So let's switch over to Therese.
Okay, great. Thank you all very much. I'm really excited to present today. Wheelchair safety has really been one of my passions throughout my career in pupil transportation as well as CPS. So let's go ahead and get started. Really, the strategies for safe travel for any student, I say student, but child who's a wheelchair user, if it's appropriate, the safest way to transport is to transfer the individual to the seat in the motor vehicle or the school bus. And that would be either with a lap and shoulder belt or in an appropriate child safety seat. So that's ideal. And I talk a lot about best practice. And then, of course, in our industry, there was always the real world. So not only that, but the wheelchair or mobility device, as it's sometimes called, should be secured in the vehicle. So you don't want to put a child in, transfer them, and then just like put the wheelchair, fold it up and put it in the back, because as we all know, that would become a projectile in a crash. These are just some recommendations. I'm going to go through a couple. This is the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations. Most of you probably already know these. The tie down should be attached to the wheelchair at 4 points, and that's industry standard. And the occupied wheelchair should be secured with a shoulder harness and lap restraint. And ideally meet the 30-mile-an-hour, 20 G-force conditions. The proper equipment. Now, this is really, really important. And back in the early, I'd say maybe late 90s, there was a voluntary standard that came out on for wheelchairs. It is not, federal mandate. It is a voluntary standard that it's called WC19. And that type of wheelchair is ideal. And in my industry, what we would do is I worked really closely with our physical therapists in the school system. And when, kids are at seating clinics, you really want to make sure that if at all possible, that they do get the WC19 chair. It's been crash tested and it complies with the standard. It also has very easily identifiable securement points, which is, again, I refer to the pupil transportation industry, but also for parents, I believe, and whether, daycare centers, any other person that's going to be transporting these, it's very easily identifiable. So you're not questioning where should I secure the attachment. If you don't have a WC19 chair, what you want to do is you want to secure it to the main frame of the wheelchair at a welded point. You don't want to secure it to the the wheels or the where your feet go, anything that can be removed. Sometimes armrests. We have seen all kinds of misuse in this industry. So, as far as proper equipment for a, someone, you want to do the wheelchair tie downs and occupant restraint system as well, and that's the WC18. And later on, we're going to give you information where you can find resources for this. They should be labeled WC18, which meets, again, the voluntary standard. And I know we work closely with Q-Strength, which is probably one of the largest manufacturers of tie downs. And so they have an excellent program. They have training. You can call them. They will help you work through any issues you may have. But basically, it's 4 straps is the most common way that is secured. And those straps can be used on a WC19 chair and a non-WC19 chair. So the correct securement of a wheelchair, again, must use 4 wheelchair securements, 2 in the front and 2 in the back. The front securement should be 3 to 8 inches outside of the chair coming in. The rear securement should be at a 45-degree angle. Again, this is best practice. Lap and shoulder belt fit securely over the middle of the shoulder, coming down and over the hips. Protecting the rider, you must use a complete set for the lap and shoulder belt. And the purpose of that, of course, is to restrain the rider in the event of a sudden stop or crash. The wheelchair must always face forward. And even as recently as last year, I was meeting with someone that worked for a hospital, and they had vans that were still transporting individuals side facing. So if you have that in your organization, or if you see that, that is really something that should be addressed immediately. Remove the trays from the occupant to prevent injury in the event of a crash. Our policy in Frederick County, students were not allowed to be transported with the tray on. Again, in a crash, that body is going to move forward and they can sustain abdominal injuries. So that was, again, our policy, that we did not transport anyone with a tray. So thinking ahead, and I don't believe a lot of people think about it, obviously, when you're in a motor vehicle crash, if you have a wheelchair user, if you're in a van, you may have a situation where it's a very unsafe place. You may be in a very rural situation, which is what we see a lot in Frederick County. You need to know your riders, what they're capable of, evaluate who needs to be evacuated. What we would do is we had constant training for our staff. They got to know the kids, what they're capable of. Our physical therapist would, as part of their healthcare plans, would identify which student should be evacuated first. And what's really important is don't wait until the emergency happens. You make a plan beforehand. So I can't stress this piece enough. We have worked very tirelessly to make sure the employees and the staff were comfortable, and they were very appreciative of that. We practiced with a mannequin for them to take the student out of the wheelchair. And again, if you have a situation where you're in a daycare or like the ARC or one of these organizations where they have several wheelchair users in a van and someone needs to be evacuated, And if you need more information, I'm available because it's a lot more complicated than this short slide, but we do a lot of training on that. As far as the IEP process and transportation, there are multiple issues that may arise, and it's really critical that it's documented because, as you know, an IEP process is, a document, a legal document, and so that's really important for to make sure that the student is safe. And some of the things that we found that were challenging sometimes were positioning. Again, best practice is a child should be the backrest positioned at an angle of 30 degrees or less from vertical. That's ideal. Some students or children cannot handle that depending on their medical condition, so they would be more than that. Making sure that anyone that rides in a motor vehicle, whether it's a school bus or a van or a private vehicle, uses a headrest. One of the issues we found that a lot of times kids would go to seating clinics, and that was not really thought about at the time, and so then they go to be transported, and we were not able to transport them without a headrest because clearly in the event of a crash, you certainly want to protect the head. Postural equipment. In our industry, it's either the parent having the child come on the bus or the school staff, whether it's a physical therapist or the teacher's assistant or the special ed assistant. All postural equipment needs to be secured on the student before they get on the bus. Climate control is a big issue, and it's gotten more and more difficult with global warming. That a lot of students have medical conditions that require climate control, and again, all these are documented in the IEP. So, and there are some very extreme situations. I want to tell you about one that we had in Frederick County. We had a student that had pica, probably one of the most extreme cases I've ever seen. And so she actually was ambulatory, but because of her condition on the bus, we transported her using a wheelchair. And because she ate anything around her, she would eat her diaper, we ended up, we couldn't safely transport her, and the doctor agreed that we would use hand restraints, to tie her hands, not tie, but, Velcro her hands down while in transport, which was very extreme, but all of that was very, serious because she would get sick from what she would eat. And, again, it was all documented in her IEP. So I want you to look at this picture and let me know. I'm just going to give you a few minutes to look at it and see what's wrong with this picture. And wherever you work, I can't stress enough to do on-site observations. Again, I've been actually in this industry since 1983. So I have seen some very interesting situations, but you train people, but you still have to go out and do observations because for whatever reason, some people just don't get it and they're securing. It's just that's in the child passenger safety world. Parents think they're doing the right thing. People in the transportation industry feel like they're doing the right thing. So in this particular situation, the student is side facing. Now, this was taken quite a few years, several years ago, and no lap and shoulder. So in the event of a crash, this child would really be injured. And in this picture, if you see, they have the tie downs so high up that in the event of a crash, that chair would probably just flip back. This is something else that we used to see a lot of. Besides, you can see how high up it's secured in the back. There's a walker attached to the back of the wheelchair. So one of the things that you really also need to be careful of, a lot of places, depending on the child's medical needs, they'll come out with walkers on the back. In our situation, it would be a giant book bag. It would be bags with diapers, formula. You have a tube-fed student or child. So these are the things. Nothing should be on the back of that chair in transport. You need to have a safe place where that equipment is secured. As you can see on this one, the tie downs are crossed in the back, which is very dangerous. What that can do in the event of a crash, that can collapse the chair. The shoulder harness is improperly placed on the student. It might be a little bit difficult to see that, but it's kind of like behind her instead of in front of her. Now in this picture, the tie downs in the front are too low. And these are pretty significant chairs, meaning weight. So that is very dangerous. No lap and shoulder belt. And if you see, they have their the trays on. I mean, that is a disaster. And again, these were just on-site observations. We would go out and view these. And so that, clearly they would be corrected, but if you work for an organization where you're daily transporting wheelchairs, you really need to have someone that can go out and do observations. And this was another one where the straps were, not only were they not at a 45-degree angle, they were crossed in the back. And I'm showing you these because I want people to really be aware of how easily it is for someone to not do the right thing, not secure the chair properly, not put the lap and shoulder belt on. And some students are verbal and they will say they don't want the lap or it's bothering my neck, so they'll put it behind them. You need to really work with the students or the children that you're transporting to make sure that they're safe. So what we would look at are the NHTSA recommendations, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations. Again, I can't stress enough the on-site observations, proper securement, and training. We spend a lot of time, our turnover rate wasn't huge, but even saying that, training is critical when you're transporting students or children that cannot transfer to the vehicle seat. So you want to make sure, ideally, they're at those angles. But the reality is most students are not. Most students, the wheelchair, you can't get a good fit with the lap and shoulder. So we try to, we work closely with our physical therapists to determine the safest way to transport.
This is the handout from the University of Michigan Transportation Research Safety Institute. It's in your handouts, and it's really excellent in having diagrams to show where the tie downs are. These points here, and Therese, chime in to make sure I'm getting this right, since this is your expertise. You can see these little tie down areas here. And then you were referencing the angle that they need to be tied. So that's also indicated on the picture. Um,
That's correct, Suzanne. And this is a great resource. Um, the University of Michigan's website is excellent. They have actually videos. I've not been there, but I went to the University of Virginia. We did the crash testing of wheelchairs. So they really work tirelessly on making sure these mobility devices are safe. But that's correct. So if you can kind of see, it's 3 to 8 inches, and they come in um, on the front, and the back goes directly up at a 45-degree angle. And again, this is ideal, but many times it's really difficult to get that angle. And these have the wheelchair has the designated um, spots on it. It typically looks like a D ring, and they are marked, so you can easily identify where to secure the chair. And if you have a chair where you don't have this, sometimes what we would do is we would take, as the parents, of course, take a little piece of tape, like blue tape or something, to mark um, the best place to secure the chair. And that way, let's say somebody else, there's a substitute and they get on and they're trying to secure the chair, they'll see where to do it.
that sounds like a great idea. I think very helpful. And you mentioned that those points are going to be like at a junction where this chair is a little stronger.
Yes, yes.
But there's more to this handout. Again, it really is an excellent resource, and I recommend you all look at it and save it and share it with the families that you work with. I'll just go through this for a moment. This particular slide brings up a question that I had for you, Therese, which is how much variety is there in kids who are sitting in wheelchairs and how well this lap and shoulder belt ends up fitting? I mean, I just know with normal people sitting not in a wheelchair using the shoulder belt that sometimes it really can be up near their ear over their neck if they're either not too big or they're it's kind of sitting off to the side a little bit. It can be a poor fit. So what have you seen, and is there anything that people can do to help adjust that shoulder belt?
So what you can do is really research the type of securements that they purchase. I mean, and they've come a long way. In a school bus, they have tracking on the side of the bus, and so you can move the shoulder portion to get a better fit. It also has an adjustable piece that comes down so that you can get a better fit. And one of the things that was difficult in our industry, we have students as young as 3 and 4 years old that we transport. Some of them are wheelchair users, and you cannot get a great fit because they're so small. So, if at all possible, depending on their disability, we would transfer those students into appropriate child safety seat or seat. And so, really, before a parent purchases anything, they need to, this would be a great resource for them. Again, making sure that they get the proper equipment and their vans or whatever vehicle they're using fitted correctly.
Absolutely. When I look at this picture, Therese, of the guy in the wheelchair, he has a head restraint there. Is there any are any of these head restraints on wheelchairs offering like a little loop, much like a high back booster might have, that where you would thread the shoulder belt through that to help position it properly? Have you seen anything like that?
I have not seen that. Um, but as I said, they have really, and again, Q-Strength's really the major manufacturer. They have done an excellent job with, developing more user-friendly devices that you can get a better fit with. But no, I have not seen anything like that. And again, this is so ideal. You would go out on a school bus and a student typically isn't sitting like that. And if they were that upright and, we would transfer them to a seat. If,
Mhm.
I mean, depending on if they were able to assist a child that size. And that's another thing that's really important is that you don't really want to, injure yourself or anyone else assisting a student. So that again goes back to the IEP. What's the safest way to transport the student and or the child, and not only that, but is it safe for school staff or bus staff to transfer?
Right. Everyone needs to be safe.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Cindy, are there any questions that particularly address what we're covering right now, or should we move on to case studies?
One was just posted. The others were technical questions. The question is, if a parent is transferring a student into a standard child restraint in the SUV type vehicle with an open trunk, what is the best way to secure the heavy wheelchair in the back of that SUV vehicle?
Well, that's a great question. I would say they would need to, I would contact the manufacturer of the vehicle to see if there's some way that they can, each vehicle is different. So you really have to look at each vehicle, but I would definitely try to secure it without, in some manner. I honestly, they would have to be really careful with that.
One of the things that I have found in working with some of the child passenger safety technicians throughout the state, some of the ones who work with cars, like some of our friends at Fitzgerald, they are really good at answering questions like that. And, I would consider talking to them. They kind of see the big picture as well, the very specific things about um, transporting children in car seats, but they also really know the car things and what you can tie something to in a vehicle. So that might be a possibility. And certainly, if you want to get a hold of somebody like that, you could contact me or the kids in safety seats folks, and we would set you up with the specific contact. All right, I think.
Yeah. Suzanne, also, depending on the vehicle, if they're transferring the child, sometimes children stay in the vehicle in the wheelchair, and sometimes they're transferred to the seat. What we do is we secure the wheelchair with the tie downs unoccupied. So sometimes, depending on the type of vehicle, that is something that I see sometimes in motor vehicles. So
That
you
makes
just,
sense.
yeah.
Right, that makes sense. You can use the features that are designed to take, the extra weight, the extra things attached to them in a crash. Wonderful. All right, let's switch over to Beth Farrell, who's going to give us some case studies.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Beth Farrell. I am a physical therapist at the Kennedy Krieger Institute's International Center for Spinal Cord Injury, and I am also both a CPST and a seating and mobility specialist, so I work a lot with children in wheelchairs. So this morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about safe transport of children who use wheelchairs from the clinician's perspective. So, PTs and OTs are uniquely qualified to provide guidance on the individual positioning needs of each patient in a wheelchair or a child restraint. Rehab therapists are able to assist with improving alignment of the spine and pelvis, as well as providing optimal position of the arms, the legs, and the head of the children when they're seated in the wheelchair. Therapists are also key players in the wheelchair evaluation process. And it's the therapist who works together with the physician and the durable medical equipment supplier to provide the recommended or prescribe the recommended seating system and the wheelchair. And that includes components that are required for safe transportation. It's imperative that those components be considered at the time of the wheelchair evaluation, as Therese had mentioned earlier, as some of the components, such as the transit option brackets, may not be added after the frame of the wheelchair is manufactured. So that's something that you have to identify as a need right at the time of the wheelchair evaluation. And then there are other components, like Therese had mentioned, a headrest or a chest harness for positioning the child in the wheelchair that may become an out-of-pocket expense for the family if it's not included in the original wheelchair prescription. Another key role of the rehab therapist is to provide the patient and family with education on how to safely transport the patient in a wheelchair, as the end goal is to maximize patient participation at home, in the school, and in the community. Therapists also connect patients with community resources such as the local CPSTs, suppliers, and organizations in the community that specialize in mobility. There are a few challenges for clinicians working to provide safe transportation for children in wheelchairs. One is that the wheelchairs are not designed for transport. They have many movable parts, and furthermore, the wheelchair is not designed to withstand crash forces because this isn't the main purpose of the wheelchair, right? The goal of the wheelchair is to provide mobility for the child. So as Therese had mentioned again, when presented with options, the general recommendation is to transfer the child out of the wheelchair and into the vehicle seat or a car seat as appropriate. Another challenge for therapists in working with children using wheelchairs in safe transportation is that PTs and OTs often have limited training on safe transportation, since this is typically not part of their professional education, right? So many of the PTs and OTs that are experienced in providing transportation recommendations have become CPSTs on their own, and that education happens outside of a typical PT and OT education. And as I had mentioned a few minutes ago, some of the wheelchair components required for safe transportation, including the transit option brackets, can be quite costly, and unfortunately, they're not always covered by insurance, which increases the out-of-pocket cost for the family. So next, I'd like to present two case studies illustrating some of the challenges and strategies used for safe transportation of children in wheelchairs. So for the first case study, we have a 5-year-old male with tetraplegia secondary to acute flaccid myelitis. So that is a non-traumatic type of spinal cord injury. And so the patient presents with paralysis of his arms, his legs. He is unable to hold his head up independently, and he has poor trunk control. He also has decreased muscle tone, so he presents as very floppy and flaccid. The child is also ventilator dependent, and he has a diaphragmatic pacemaker as well. And so what that is, it's a lightweight battery powered box that's external to the body, and it attaches into the patient's abdomen to electrically stimulate the diaphragm muscle and nerves. And the goal of that device is to decrease the patient's reliance on the mechanical ventilator. But for the time being, this child has both the ventilator and the diaphragmatic pacemaker, which are required for him to breathe. And this young man is dependent for mobility using a tilt and space manual wheelchair. This picture illustrates the wheelchair setup that the patient will transport in. So we've got a tilt and space manual wheelchair, and you can see in the front, they're in the back as well, but you can see in the front that he's got the transit tie downs. He also has a headrest, and because he is unable to hold his head up independently in any direction, he also has swing away lateral supports to provide some additional support at his head. The patient's ventilator is attached to the back of his wheelchair, and the diaphragmatic pacemaker is also attached to the back of his wheelchair, and it is inside of that little giraffe backpack that you see there. So one of the biggest questions for this patient is, right, he's a 5-year-old, should he transport in a car seat or in the wheelchair? So as CPSTs and therapists, our role is really to provide education and recommendations to the family, but that the child's parents are ultimately the decision makers when it comes to these tough choices. So in this situation, the family ultimately decided on transporting the child in the wheelchair for 3 reasons. The first is that it is very difficult to transfer this patient into and out of the wheelchair, let alone it would be even more challenging into and out of a car seat due to his poor head control and trunk control, plus the ventilator tubing, and there's wires for the diaphragmatic pacer. It's just a very challenging transfer into small spaces. The second thing that played into the family's decision is that they report that the vehicle is very small. So he is an international patient, and the family reports that the cars at home are not as spacious as the cars here. So we're talking with like a very limited amount of space in the vehicle to begin with. Additionally, they have another young child in the family who also uses a car seat. And so because of the small size of the car, plus an additional car seat, there's no room for the patient would most likely require a larger medical car seat. And so the family ultimately decided to utilize a wheelchair accessible private or public transportation to get this little one where he needs to go. And some of the family education provided include to make sure, it wasn't in the picture, but he will also have a tray with the wheelchair, to make sure the tray is removed, to make sure that the medical equipment is being secured properly. So for the ventilator to be removed from the wheelchair and placed in a safe place in the vehicle, to make sure that there's adequate tubing so that it's not pulling on the patient's tracheostomy, and to find a good spot in the vehicle to place the ventilator, maybe put some pillows around the ventilator for stability or secure it in another fashion. And that goes for the diaphragmatic pacemaker as well, to ensure that it's not just hanging on the wheelchair, but that there's a safe place for that. We also talked to the family about making sure that the patient's position in the wheelchair is 30 degrees of tilt or less. And when we did the wheelchair evaluation, considerations for his personal wheelchair also were to include that he had the transit bracket, the headrest, and also a chest harness. Now, of course, he'll still be using the lap and shoulder belt into the vehicle for safe transportation, but he needs that chest harness and a pelvic positioning belt to make sure that he stays in a good place in the wheelchair. So our second case study today is a 12-year-old female with tetraplegia secondary to a traumatic spinal cord injury. So she also presents with paralysis of her arms and legs. Unlike the last child, she presents with spasticity and high muscle tone throughout her arms, legs, and trunk. And she does present with a number of postural abnormalities. So she's got a pelvic obliquity. She has some where she's sitting more on one side of the pelvis to another. She has some scoliosis, head forward posture. So those things need to be addressed with her positioning in the wheelchair. And she is able to move independently using a power wheelchair. So this is the patient placed in a demo wheelchair as we were going through the personal power wheelchair evaluation process, trying different pieces of equipment. So this one is not transit ready for her. But things that we wanted to consider when prescribing a wheelchair were to make sure that she could be independent with her mobility from the wheelchair. We wanted to optimize her position of her hips and her spine, also provide some stabilities during her activities of daily living. Because she had some poor trunk control and high spasticity, she had a tendency to fall forward when seated in the wheelchair. But of course, we also wanted to make sure that the wheelchair had all of the components required for safe transportation. So she's someone, because she has good head control, she does not necessarily need the use of a headrest in functioning in her daily life. However, that's something that we absolutely made sure was included in the wheelchair prescription, as Therese had mentioned, to make sure that she has that posterior stability during transportation. So for this young lady, her family had purchased a wheelchair accessible van, and then it was also written into her IEP that she was to have wheelchair accessible transport to and from her school. And when we did that wheelchair evaluation, we were sure to include the transit bracket options, a headrest, the chest strap and pelvic positioning belt to keep her well positioned in the chair, but then also educated her and her family on the use of the Q strains and the vehicle's lap and shoulder belt over top of the anterior chest strap and the pelvic positioning belt. Like the other case study, we educated the patient and family on limiting tilt to 30 degrees or less during transportation. And then this family ultimately had an easy lock installed in the family vehicle. And so what that is a lock where a component is installed to the base of the wheelchair. And I believe it's the female part is installed on the base of the wheelchair and the male part, and then there's a receiving female part that is in the vehicle so that the child is able to just drive into the bracket independently and it locks her in place instead of being reliant on parents or caregivers to individually strap her into the vehicle using Q strain. So it gives this young lady a little bit more independence with that. So that's all that I had for you all today. So I will turn it back over to you, Suzanne.
All right, thank you. Very interesting. And I'm really glad you talked about kind of the family education and what I think of as the big picture car issues. The child passenger safety technicians in the listening audience knows that we really try to talk about how you need to consider, are there other riders in the car? You know, are they kids in car seats? Are they older kids who are in seatbelts that need to be accessing all of that? And you mentioned, Beth, the medical equipment and how to secure that. And all these things are really important that, you know, it's so easy to get caught up in the very specific child you're looking at and their particular equipment, but yet we really do need to think about these other things that can really make the whole tr transport safe or not safe if we don't include these considerations. So Cindy, let me ask you if we have any questions to address right now.
We have a response to the question we talked about earlier from Claire Myers from Kids in Safety Seats. One of the options to consider when a wheelchair is being placed into a vehicle that is, and I'm adding introduction to this, these are not all Claire's words, sorry, I just want to be completely transparent. When trying to secure a wheelchair in a vehicle that does not have a wheelchair securing capacity like a school bus or a specifically modified van, Claire's suggestion is it seems like there might be a situation where a platform outside of the vehicle could be used to transport and secure the wheelchair. I don't have any other questions at this time, but I have just sent a chat out reminding people that they can submit questions.
Okay.
And I have both the chat and the questions open.
Okay. What I will do then, while we wait to see if any more questions come in, is let me go on to the next slide. This is the video that I mentioned. This was part of our presentation about 5 years ago on wheelchairs. It's Carolyn Derriman is a nurse with Baltimore County Health Department, and she's a child passenger safety technician. And she's also a parent of a child who's been in a wheelchair all his life. And she presented about the parent's perspective. And it's really, really excellent. I reviewed it, and everything is still very current to give you that angle on it. A lot about how do you obtain the right wheelchair and wheelchairs versus like stroller more systems and the pros and cons. Anyway, I strongly recommend you listen to this. So it is listed, the website is here, it's on YouTube, and in your handouts there's also that listed, but I would recommend that you listen to that if you haven't in the past. We also have a resource page, and that's here, and that's also in the handouts. So the Ride Safer handout that I mentioned before is listed here if you wanted to obtain it online, or if you wanted to see some of the crash testing videos and other handouts that they have. They're all with the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute. We've mentioned Q-Straint as one of the main companies that provide some of the securement equipment, so they are listed. The Automotive Safety Program at the Indiana University School of Medicine is a great resource for special needs transport in general. There's a listing here for converting vans and some help with assistive technology. Let's see, what else? We have also from Easy On Vests, if you're familiar with those products. A lot of times their products are made to work in conjunction with wheelchair transport, and that company is very good about personalizing their vests to meet very specific needs of particular children. So all of those are there, and you can print that out from your handouts. So Cindy, are there any other questions?
There are not any other questions. Hold on. One is coming in. I don't have it quite yet. While it's coming in, I want to echo what you said about the University Wheelchair Transport Safety page of University of Michigan, and they do have that brochure in Spanish, French, and English, and then an Australian version also in English, which I have not opened up, but I imagine it's because of different safety requirements in that country. We have a question from Salisbury. Do you have any handouts about the Maryland law in riding in wheelchairs in vehicles?
Wow.
I do not know the answer to that. We may
Yes.
need to ask the audience if they could. I don't believe that the child passenger safety law specifically refers to that. There may be something in the wider vehicle law book, and we could clearly take that offline and ask our colleagues at the School of Law to do some research through the Partnership for Safer Maryland. I'm going to.
That's a stumper of a question. There is, I believe, still a clause in the Maryland law that states if you have a medical need and a letter from your doctor, you can be exempt from the rest of the child passenger safety laws. So maybe that would be needed in some cases. Our friends with kids in safety seats might be able to address that a little bit too. But as Cindy said, we can look into that and find out more. And we can follow up with all of the listeners if we get more information on that. Okay,
There's a thank you from the person. There's a thank you from the person. It is from Wicomico County Health Department, and we can get back to, as you said, everybody, but it's going to take some digging, and the law students are really good at that.
Yes.
There are not any other questions. There are a number of people who are saying thank you for the webinar and for all of the handouts.
Okay, well, let's see. We did talk about the handouts. Let's just go on to the very last page here since we don't have any more questions. So as I mentioned, you will have a very brief evaluation that'll be sent to you automatically after you log out of the webinar. You'll also receive an email that has proof of obtaining one CEU from Safe Kids Worldwide towards your child passenger safety technician recertification. For those of you who could use a certificate to show that you participated in this for whatever reason, I'd be happy to send you one of those. Just give me a quick email at cps@mems.org. That's MEMSS.org, and I'd be happy to do that. So if there's no further questions, we will adjourn this, and thank you very much for participating, and we hope that you all stay safe.
At this time, I'm going to end the webinar, which will also end the conference call. Thank you for participating. This will be available online for future viewing.